and welcome to the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast for the second time on November 3rd, 2025. My name is Tom Luongo. We have a lot to talk about. This is episode 237, and I have with me the great pleasure of getting back to discussing with Richard Poe, author and investigative journalist Richard Poe, who's been on the cast twice before, and both of those episodes are bangers, folks. I'm going to tell you right now, episodes 146 and 171 are absolute required listening. Richard's here to discuss today. We're going to continue the discussion about why all roads lead to London. Richard, how are you?
Just great, Tom. Great to be back.
It's really good to talk to you. And as I said to you, when we were setting this up, and I'm going to, make the public apology. It's 18 months between conversations is way too long. So with that said, what I want to talk about today is this, here we are. The last time we spoke was March of 2024. We were about 6 months after 10/7, the Hamas attack on Israel. And you had just published an article before you published the book of the same name, which is how the British invented communism and blamed it on the Jews. And the article itself was a lightning rod for me. And then, of course, you were kind enough to send me a copy of the book, which I read, which I adored. I have recommended that book to a number of different people. One of the things I'm watching now that we're just over 2 years after 10/7 is what I've been seeing and what I've been arguing for strenuously in public is that I'm watching the British turn one of their assets into, and burn one of their assets in order to protect themselves and to try and attack Donald Trump and what he's trying to do to change the course of America. So I was wondering, with that said, I know of all people that I can think of that can give us, the historical perspective on how the British do what my friend Alex Craner likes to call the ant jar experiment. Take red ants and black ants, put them in a jar and shake them up, and then profit off the chaos. I know this, you're the person for that in my mind. So in the inciting incident for your book, in that book is a speech by Winston Churchill in 1920, where he was trying to blame basically World War I on the Jews. And, knowing full well that he was the one who was actually, behind almost all of it. And it's like going through the layers of how they structure their campaigns, right? Their geopolitical campaigns, I think, is the part that everybody's missing in this conversation, because they see the surface level stuff and then they miss all the nuance of what's been going on behind the scenes the entire time. So why don't we just start there?
I think maybe what people often underestimate is the tremendous power of Great Britain. Not only, let's say, 100 years ago, the period I was writing about in my book, but today as well. And the fact that so many of these maneuvers, such as, for example, you were implying earlier, perhaps the British are throwing Israel under the bus, throwing this nation which they actually created.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps they're throwing them under the bus now by getting behind this whole anti-Israel, anti-Semitism campaign that's being promoted in social media. But when I look at it from a historical perspective, and looking back to the events I discuss in my book, and I will say the title, How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. What I see is a parallel where in the 1919 and 1920, the British government did, in fact, launch a very similar anti-Jewish campaign using the media of that time, and in which Winston Churchill personally took part, in which they were basically blaming the Bolshevik Revolution on the Jews and saying that the Jews were responsible not only for Bolshevism in Russia, but basically for all radical revolutionary movements which had troubled Europe for the last, at that point, 150 years. And so in one article in particular, written by Winston Churchill himself, who was then War Secretary of Great Britain, he put forth this idea. He accused the Jews of having fomented and orchestrated the Bolshevik Revolution, and he further accused them of basically being behind all other revolutionary movements in Europe in the last 150 years. And so on the surface, that was a, a devastating propaganda blow against the Jewish people, which had very tragic consequences because Adolf Hitler picked up on it. This article was written by Churchill in I think it was February of 1920,
Hmm.
and Churchill more or less echoed those same ideas in another writing, Mein Kampf, which was published in 1925, 5 years later. And so, one of the very clear things that I noted in my book is the influence over Nazi ideology that was exercised by this intense anti-Jewish campaign by the British 5 years before Hitler wrote his seminal book, his manifesto. So, so what was Churchill trying to accomplish by this? It turns out that it was really a very temporary campaign. It only lasted a couple of years, 1919, 1920. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not sure I would read too much into the current anti-Jewish campaign, which I think we both agree is emanating primarily from Great Britain and from their extremely effective uh, organs of state propaganda.
Hmm.
I think it's emanating from them today, just as it was back in 1919 and 1920. And it's one of the reasons I'm skeptical that this is going to have a long-lasting effect, is because it didn't before.
Really? Okay.
It was well, I mean, of course, if you count Nazism in World War II and all that,
Yep.
I guess it did. So maybe we shouldn't discount that aspect. But in terms of what the British were trying to accomplish for their own policy
Mm.
ends, it was very short-lived, and they stopped doing it after a couple of years. And maybe in a sense, they handed off the ball to the Germans after that. But what they were trying to do, I argue in my book, was they were trying to shift the blame from the Bolsheviks for the Bolshevik Revolution from the Jew. I mean, that is from the British government, from the British
Mhm.
secret services to the Jews. And this is the thing that surprises most people. They say, "What are you talking about? What did the British secret services have to do with the Bolshevik Revolution?" And in fact, they had everything to do with it. The British government orchestrated not only the Bolshevik Revolution, but a number of revolutions preceding it and a number of wars and other circumstances preceding it, which all were calculated to weaken the Russian Empire, to weaken the Tsarist regime in
Mhm.
a very long-term, persistent strategy, which had been going on since the early 1900s at least, and which no power on earth ever could have pulled off other than the British Empire.
Mm.
And so this is one of the arguments that I make in my book, which people often don't understand. They say, "Oh, Richard, you're just trying to cover up for the Jews. You know, you're just getting that $7,000, and you know."
I, it's really a hilarious talking point that's out there today. Like, I'm looking around, going, okay, yeah, all right, fine, all right, yeah,
But people say that to me.
yeah, yeah.
They think I'm trying to cover up for some reason or other, and I'm really not. And in fact, I think it's on page 2 of my book. I basically concede the point that the Bolshevik movement was disproportionately Jewish
Mm.
in its membership and in its leadership. And I cite some reliable sources on that. I concede the point right up front. And I make it clear I'm not contending that that's not what I'm contending. What I am saying is that's only half the story. And the other half of the story is that the Bolsheviks, whoever they were, had absolutely no capability of overthrowing the Russian monarchy or the Russian Empire or ultimately the Russian armed forces in the Russian Civil War. And they
Mm.
had to do all three of those things. And the Bolsheviks had no capability to do that. They had no resources to do it. They had no training or expertise to do it. They literally had nothing that would be required to accomplish such a stupendous feat to overthrow the Russian Empire. They could not do it. They had no ability. But the British were able to do it. They had been working on that very project for 300 years, as I
Mhm.
explain in my book. They saw Russia as their chief rival, their primary enemy in the world, and they worked literally for centuries to destroy them. And this campaign to take down Russia reached special intensity in the late 19th century and in the early 1900s. And just to give an example, one of the most devastating blows that was struck against the Russian Empire was the Russo-Japanese War, which
Mm.
took place in, what was it, 1904? I think it started in 1904 and went into 1905. Now, that was that war was totally made in Great Britain. The British had literally built the Japanese Navy for them. All those Japanese battleships were built in British shipyards, and then the British trained the Japanese how to run them. And then finally, the British instigated the Japanese to pick a fight with Russia, which resulted in the destruction of the Russian fleet and the collapse, the near collapse of the Russian monarchy in 1905. The fomenting of the 1905 revolution, which forced the Tsar to create a Duma, to create a parliament
Mm.
that was in opposition to him, and which ultimately became the engine of the revolution a few years later. This was all done by Great Britain, and it was just one of many projects, one of many operations they conducted over many years that were like sledgehammer blows against Russian power and Russian stability. And the Bolsheviks couldn't do that. The Bolsheviks, they couldn't build a navy for Japan. They couldn't train the Japanese how to work that navy. They couldn't instigate the Japanese government to attack Russia. Nobody could do that. In fact, no country on earth could do that other than Great Britain at the time. All
Mhm.
three of those things that they had to do to make the Russo-Japanese War happen were things that Great Britain was uniquely able to do, and nobody else was, not even other empires on the earth at that time. It was literally something that only England could do, and they did it. And
Mhm.
they did many other things as well. And so you have the Bolsheviks who were basically intellectuals and in most cases well, really kind of losers in life, maladapted people, people who may have been very smart, but they weren't really very good at doing things in the real world. These people, if they had not received massive state support from powers such as especially Great Britain, also Germany at one point, if they had not received this kind of funding and support and supervision from great sovereign powers and great intelligence agencies, they literally would have not been able to accomplish anything in their lives
Mhm.
other than sitting around in coffee houses and bickering with each other. It was the only thing they knew how to do, really.
Right.
So what happened was the British in their planning for how to defeat Russia, one of the things they did is they looked at the Russian Empire, this vast landmass composed of many different races, many different religions, many different ethnicities. They examined all the races and ethnicities and religious groups. and assessed what their grievances were against the Tsar, against the Russian monarchy. And then they went in there, recruited them, funded them, trained them, coordinated them, and made promises to them. If you play ball with us, we will give you X, whatever it is you want. So
Mm.
for the Polish nationalists, the Polish separatists, we will give you a free and independent Poland. To the Finns, we will give you a free and independent Finland. Same to the Baltic states, to the Ukrainians, to the people in the Caucasian republics, we'll call them now. They weren't exactly republics then. But to each and every ethnic group, they promised something. And the Jews were one of those ethnic groups. The Jews were a very sizable and important minority within the Russian Empire who had what they thought were grievances against the government, against the Russian Empire, and who also had resources. They had a worldwide diaspora, which included a lot of influential, wealthy, and powerful people. So they were the Jews were a very promising ethnic group to for the British to recruit for this project, along with all the other ethnic groups. So to the people who say, "Oh, what you're just ignoring the fact that the Jews were uh, participants in this," I'm not ignoring it at all. I'm simply saying that they were participants in the same way and on the same terms that many of these other ethnic groups who were recruited by the British were. So, for example, if you look at the Poles, now the Poles actually were a real country. I mean, they had a military, they had a great warrior tradition, a very fierce and warlike people going back for many centuries in Europe. So in some ways, they had a lot more to bring to the table in terms of the kinds of help the British needed. But at the time of the Russian revolutions, the Poles were completely powerless because they had been divided up. There was no Poland. Their country had been divided up completely between three great empires, the German, Austrian, and Russian empires, and there was no Poland anymore. And the Poles were never going to come back from that situation. Left to their own devices, with their country divided up between three such mighty empires as Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and
Mm-hmm.
Russia, they were not ever going to come back from that. They were gone. They were done. The only reason they came back is because the British came in and helped them once again by this campaign of many years of softening up the Russian Empire, destabilizing the Russian Empire, infiltrating it, subverting it, sowing the seeds of dissension between all the component subject peoples who lived in the Russian Empire, and then working closely with the Poles themselves directly, making them promises, helping them organize their resistance, helping them organize their paramilitary forces, which would ultimately become their national army, and then helping them once the revolution finally broke out in Russia, giving them aid and support, uh, diplomatic support, funding, arms, everything that they needed. And so once the revolution broke out, and I show in my book, you can get to this later. The revolution was totally, that is the initial revolution, the February 1917 revolution, in which the Tsar was overthrown and the sort of liberal elements led by Kerensky took power. This was totally coordinated by Great Britain and from the British embassy in Petrograd, and this I show very clearly in my book. But before I go into that, so once that revolution was instigated,
Mm-hmm.
and then the British continued destabilizing the country after the liberal forces of the Duma took over, allowing the Bolsheviks to take over. once those two revolutions happened, uh, especially the Bolshevik Revolution, then all the separatists immediately declared independence.
Hmm.
Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, the states in the Caucasus, Ukraine, many, many states, the whole empire just suddenly broke apart. All these different uh, territories, these provinces, declared their independence, and many of them had very substantial armies. All of them were being encouraged, equipped, funded, and otherwise helped by the British, and played off in many cases against each other and against the Russian government and against the White Russians, who were also being supported by the British. And so here we have the real event that caused the Bolshevik takeover. It wasn't the revolution that caused the takeover. It was the Russian Civil War,
Hmm.
because
Okay.
when the Bolsheviks, and please, if you have any questions
Yeah,
or
yeah,
comments.
yeah. I'm getting there. That's interesting. But go ahead, keep going. You're good.
Okay, so the Russian Civil War is where the rubber really met the road. That's where the Bolsheviks actually took over.
Right.
And that was the one place where it becomes totally obvious that the British were the deciding force, because the Bolsheviks were led, they appointed as their commander in chief Leon Trotsky, a guy who never served in the military in his life, had zero training or knowledge of military things, and they made him the commander of the Bolshevik forces by land and sea. And he supposedly won this gigantic Russian Civil War, which went from, well, let's say roughly from 1918 till, let's say, 1922. It actually continued till 1924, but it was largely over by 1921. But this war went on 3, 4, 5 years, depending on how you want to calculate it. And this was a huge war. 10 million people died in
Mhm.
this war, 10 million. And it was a war in which the Reds were fighting against the Whites, the Bolsheviks against the counter-revolutionaries, who were the white Russian forces, basically the remnants of the Tsar's army led by the Tsar's generals,
Mhm.
uh, battle-hardened troops who had fought all through World War I for the Tsar, uh, troops who were really, really knew how to fight. And they, in addition to those white Russians, there were all the separatist armies I mentioned, all the different elements who were trying to break away from the empire, all fighting against the Bolsheviks. And then in addition, the Allied armies of intervention, because as early as 1918, the Allies began putting troops on the ground in Russia. They came in through the northern port of Archangel. The British, primarily 60,000 British troops, were stationed in Russia, as well as many troops from other nationalities. There were 13,000 Americans. There were basically troops from every allied country, including Japan. Japan actually had the most, and I believe they had, if I remember right, upwards of 300,000 Japanese troops, because they had
Wow.
ambitions. Yes, they had ambitions in the east, and they
Right.
wanted to take over, the eastern part of Russia. So there were all these foreign troops, plus all the separatist troops from all the separatist areas, plus the white armies, which are estimated to be as much as 300,000, and the Allied armies were about 200,000, uh, minus the Japanese contingent. The separatists, I don't know what the number is there, but just the Bolsheviks were basically limited to two cities. They had Petrograd, they had Moscow, and they had some surrounding areas, and they had whatever red militias they could muster. But they were surrounded. They were completely surrounded, hopelessly outnumbered, totally ill-equipped, uh, and completely helpless. with all these enemy forces, let's say in 1918, early 1919, all these enemy forces closing in around them, advancing on them. And how did they win? And their commander, the only commander they had was Leon Trotsky, who was an egghead. He was a guy who was a coffee house debater,
Right.
and with literally no expertise to do anything else. How did they do it? And the answer is that the British helped them. The British helped them in two ways: by hindering all the opposing forces and not allowing them to finish off the Bolsheviks, and then by giving the Bolsheviks various kinds of support secretly, covertly, under the table, while openly pretending to support the anti-Bolsheviks, but actually hindering them. And I call this process the Vietnam before Vietnam,
Hmm.
because we as Americans, at least those of us who are boomers, uh, we can remember this strange time. I was just a kid in the 60s, but I remember very well the strange circumstances of the Vietnam War, where there were these guys in pajamas, the Viet Cong, and they were supposedly beating us and all of our might and all of our equipment and all of our aircraft and everything. And this is when the world was still run by the World War II generation.
Right.
And I remember the shock of my parents. They just couldn't understand it. How are these guys in pajamas beating the United States of America? And we have this whole mythology. Well, it's because of the purity of their hearts and the justice of their cause. And you may remember, Tom, this was back in I don't remember if it was the 70s or the 80s, but everyone started talking about this book by this General Giap, who had supposedly been the great military genius who won the Vietnam War
Hmm.
for the North Vietnamese. And I read this guy's book. Everyone was talking about it at a certain point. It was all over the media saying, "Oh, this book! Every American commander needs to read this book to find out how they beat us and how they
Hmm.
won." I read this book. It was just pure kindergarten level communist agitprop. There was nothing in this book that made sense about military strategy or anything else. It was just all about, oh, the proletariat united with the peasantry and this and that. I mean, just really really Komsomol level, a grade school level communist propaganda of the most basic, silly type. And that's
Right.
what was in this guy's book. And everyone was, including our American leaders and military people and intelligence people, were pretending this was a brilliant book that just totally explains why they beat us. And it was nothing of the sort. It was not brilliant, and it didn't explain anything. It was all a fraud. And so there was no great military strategy. There was no secret to why the communists beat us in Vietnam. It wasn't a secret at all. It was the very thing that Joe McCarthy and Richard Nixon and all those other anti-communist leaders of the 1950s said from the beginning. They said that it was our own people who betrayed us.
Hmm.
And you may remember the whole anti-communist movement of the 1950s began with the question, who lost China? This is what got people up in arms initially, was the fact it was bad enough that somehow Stalin had taken over half of Europe, but then China suddenly fell to the communists, and people were saying, how did this happen? What happened? That was the question. Who lost China? And the answer that Joe McCarthy and all these anti-communist crusaders came up with, they said it was an inside job. It was our own people handing China over to the communists. That these scruffy revolutionaries led by Mao Zedong simply did not have the capability to overthrow Chiang Kai-shek and his and the extraordinary support that he had from the West, or that he supposedly had,
Mm-hmm.
that he used to have. And all of a sudden, that support was withdrawn and it was given to the communists. And this was the basis of the McCarthyism, as it's called, and the whole anti-communist movement of the 1950s was people waking up to this astonishing and horrifying fact that our own people had betrayed us to the communists for reasons unknown.
Mm.
And this is why now today, when you have people, and we still have them even now, in the era of Twitter and X and social media, we still have people reading the old propaganda that says, "Oh, how dare you promote conspiracy theories? Don't you realize that's a completely maladaptive way of looking at things, and it's obviously so untrue, and you must have psychological problems." And so we still have this idea that if you say something that's different from the mainstream, what the mainstream media or mainstream academia is telling you, that you must be doing it for deep-seated emotional and psychological reasons. And this whole attitude, this beating up on conspiracy theorists, quote unquote, and saying they're doing something wrong, or they're doing something that shows they're unbalanced mentally, this harks back to the 1950s. This is when they started pushing that idea very hard.
Mm-hmm.
And it was precisely because the message of Joe McCarthy et al. Was getting traction with
Yep.
the masses of the people. People were understanding he's right. The communists couldn't have done this by themselves. People in our own government let them do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm saying in my book, How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews, what I'm saying in that book is perfectly consistent with the later uh,
Iterations of.
anti-communists in the 1950s and 60s. It's perfectly consistent. It's giving the same message. It's saying that if you look at the history of communism all the way back to the very, very beginning, you find the same thing. You find that it's the ruling classes of the leading Western powers who made it happen, who
Mm-hmm.
allowed it to happen, and that these scruffy bands of revolutionaries and Red Guards or whoever, they simply didn't have the ability to do these mighty feats that are attributed to them. They absolutely didn't. And
What's funny, Richard, I'm going to pop in here just a second and say this is why, you know, I changed my view on how I saw American politics, you know, starting with about halfway through the first Trump administration. Um, you know, previous to that, I would argue that I was a, pretty kind of typical anti, so disappointed by my own country that I would rather um, criticize it for its imperial behavior rather than look as to how is it possible that we got to this point. And slowly over time, it became, no, we're just run by vandals. These people aren't incompetent. We're being run with our country is being run by traitors, and
mhm.
at every level. And it became very obvious during the Biden junta that these people were just, that was my entire argument throughout the entire time, was that, oh no, these people are just selling us out to someone else. And then when you go through okay, so who would they be selling us out to? Well, not selling us out to Israel. It wasn't Israel that ran the Russiagate thing. That didn't go through the Mossad. Maybe the Mossad might have been involved in it, but that all went through MI6. That all went through GCHQ, right? Why would they want to get rid of Trump? Why would they want to do that? It doesn't make any sense. Trump's a middle of the road, from by common um US political calculus. The guy's a centrist. He's not even all that
Hmm.
interesting, right? Like, why would you what about Trump was so threatening? I mean, he was pro-Israel and probably, the most pro-Israel friggin' president that we've had since, I don't know, Reagan. Like, why would he, I'm probably even like misstating that one, but what is so threatening about Trump that he had to be taken down, that he had to be turned into, creamsicle Hitler, for lack of a better term? And like, now you have to, the histrionics surrounding Trump were so over the top that it calls attention to the fact that the histrionics are so over the top. And you ask yourself, why? He's not even all that interesting, right? Not as a political figure, but when you dig into all the policy prescriptions, you dig into what he was actually wanting to do, there's only one group of people whose power he actually threatened. You start talking about NATO paying its own way. You start talking about the UN climate change and the this and the that. None of that is an expression of quote unquote Jewish power, unquote. That's all dumb. This is all coming directly out of the European, City of London axis of control through the banking system and through the regulatory post World War II institutions. Now, the counter to everything you said so far, and I'm going to play devil's advocate, even though I don't believe it, and I'm making this abundantly clear, which is to say the following. Well, you do know that when you say British, you actually mean Jews. Okay.
I've heard that. Yeah.
Hell, I used to say it, right? I've come, when I didn't understand the nuance of all this stuff, when I was on the path to trying to make a better model of how the world actually operates, at one point, yeah, I was one of those guys. And I'm not that guy anymore, because, when the truth is put in front of you and you have data that contravenes that, again, how can this, let's make it simple. How can this shitty little country have so much power over the entire world? It's the same model you asked that question. Is no different than the model that you've already put on the table for everybody to understand. How did the Bolsheviks win? They won by getting support. Why is Ukraine in the position it's in today? Because it's been getting egregious levels of support. Why is Iran an antipode to Israel? Because all of these things, and when you stop and you start stripping away the layers of the bullshit and the media veneer of this is the story you're supposed to believe in, you start to realize, no, the world is far more complicated than you think it is. So, this story has played itself out, and this little psychodrama has played itself out many, 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 many times. So, in some ways, what I learned most from reading first your article and then your book was that the concept of the color revolution, which is what you described early in the podcast, when you're describing the lead up to the Bolshevik Revolution, that period from 1905 to 1917, that was the laying the groundwork for what you would consider a color revolution. We would consider today. And and I've gotten to the point now where I go back and I look at the 1840s and the 1850s here in the United States over slavery, and I'm like, oh, look, it's the color revolutionary playbook over and over again. Once you get the blueprint, you can start overlaying, and maybe it's not a one-to-one overlaying, but when every time it's the British Foreign Office involved in it, it's kind of hard to not see the pattern.
Well, yes, and I was I was about to say something else, but
Okay.
when you brought up the American Civil War as an example of this kind of British essentially color revolution,
Mm-hmm.
an uprising and revolution, a civil war, which is artificially created by the destabilizing activity of foreign intelligence agencies. Let's define it that way.
Sure.
I happen to be writing my next book on that subject,
Okay.
which is coming out imminently. Um, it's the working title is "Who Killed Lincoln? The Case Against England." So, I mean, we can get into that
Oh,
later if
yeah,
you like.
well, happy to go. We're happy to go there. I know I know a couple of ladies over at Promethean Action that will agree with you 100%. But go ahead. Um,
Right. But before I go off on that tangent, I just want to take advantage of that moment to
oh,
mention
sure, absolutely,
my
please do.
forthcoming book. But what I wanted to say about this, to reinforce this idea that the British did the Bolshevik Revolution,
Hmm.
in some ways, my strongest source on that, I relied very heavily on a British historian named Martin Gilbert,
Okay.
who was the official biographer for Churchill, approved and appointed by the Churchill family. And he wrote an essentially an official multi-volume biography of Churchill and all his achievements, which was approved by the family and would have been approved by Churchill himself. So some people look at that and say, oh, well, that was totally biased in Churchill's favor. Yes, absolutely it was. But that's what makes it all the better for my purposes. Because to me, drawing on Martin Gilbert's work is almost like bringing back Winston Churchill from the dead
Mm.
and having him speak for himself. That's essentially what it is. This was a guy who was officially appointed to do that, to be Churchill's apologist to all of human history. And he did in a massive multi-volume work with absolutely exhaustive, consummate research and sourcing, massive sourcing, much of it from archives not available to the general public or even to scholars. So it was a massive, uh, you could say, propaganda effort to
Mm.
give Churchill a chance to explain himself to history. And why that's good for me is because I can, through this work, I can say, well, look, Winston, since we've got you back from the dead to speak for yourself, how did we lose Russia? How did that happen? How you were the war secretary
Hmm.
during the Russian Civil War? You were actually personally in charge of the Russian Civil War, and the British War Office was running that war. They were remember they had just won World War One, and they had become the most powerful country in the world. But the British they had 60,000 troops on the ground in Russia. They had immediately sent 40,000 troops to seize the Caucasian oil fields. And they brought all these other troops in. And Churchill was in charge of the whole shebang. He was
Hmm.
running all of those separatist movements I was talking about. He was running the whole Allied intervention force. The British were leading it. He was running the White Russian armies. The White Russians were being funded, armed, and supported in every way by Great Britain. They didn't dare make a move without checking with the British War Office. Is it okay if we do this? Is it okay if we do that? Winston Churchill was running the entire massive theater of the Russian Civil War throughout its duration. And he was personally responsible and personally in a position to bring forth from that conflict any result that he wanted. He
Right.
had the power to do it because there was no other power. There were just all these other powers competing with
Mm.
each other on Russian territory. There was no Russian government. The Bolsheviks, as I described, were just one of these many forces, and they had nothing that gave them any advantage. So through this work of Martin Gilbert, we can say, Winston, how did you blow this? How did you
Right.
let the communists win? And Churchill gives us an answer. He says it very clearly. He says, the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, did not allow me to defeat the Bolsheviks. On the contrary, Lloyd George made very clear on multiple occasions in writing that he wanted the Bolsheviks to win, and he most definitely did not want the White Russians to win. Churchill, and I believe him, Churchill wanted the White Russians to win. He
Mm.
was rooting for the White Russians, and that was basically his job. And if you read the history books, it says that the British and the whole Allied intervention force, which the British were leading, was supposedly there to help the White Russians win and to defeat the Bolsheviks. But Churchill himself, through his official biographer, says, no, that's not what was happening at all. Churchill says, I was trying to do that. I was trying to fight the Bolsheviks. I was trying to help the White Russians to win. And Lloyd George, in his war cabinet meetings, was clearly saying, no, Winston, I'm not going to let you do that because I want the Bolsheviks to win. So this comes right from the horse's mouth, from
Mm.
Winston Churchill himself. You can take it or leave it. You can say, oh, well, maybe that's just Churchill defending himself, but it's massively documented,
Mm-hmm.
massively documented. I relied very heavily on that book in those portions of my book where I discussed the actual executive decisions made in the British government to help
Mm-hmm.
the Bolsheviks win. And just to give you an example of the type of decision that Churchill was describing and that he was accusing Lloyd George of doing. So, for example, at one point, uh, Admiral Geni- not Admiral, General Denikin was advancing from the south, a white Russian commander. He was coming up from the Ukraine, and advancing on Moscow. And Churchill wanted to give him all kinds of support, logistic and otherwise, including economic support by opening up trade with those areas under Denikin's command so that he could get money, which they always needed. And Lloyd George totally nixed the idea. He says Denikin is an arch reactionary type of person. We can't trust him. He's not with the program. He'll probably set up a military dictatorship. We don't want that. Or he might bring back the Romanov dynasty and have a constitutional monarchy, and we don't want that either.
Mm-hmm.
Lloyd George was absolutely on the record in writing saying he does not want to bring back the Tsar in any form, even in the form of a liberal constitutional monarchy. He was totally committed to letting the Bolsheviks win. And there is circumstance after circumstance like this where something Winston Churchill wanted to do was nixed by Lloyd George, always on those grounds. No, we can't have those white Russians win because they're conservatives,
Mm.
because they're
Right.
Trump,
Right.
basically.
Right. Well,
And
it's interesting. Like, you bring all that up. So this is really fascinating, right? So now let's go back to what we said, where we started the podcast, which was the article by Churchill in February of 1920, where he then blamed the Bolshevik Revolution on the Jews. So,
right.
like, close that loop for us, if you will. Like, so, if Churchill was stymied on this, right, then, and we know, and you make the argument in the book, if I remember correctly, you make the argument that he knew damn well that it wasn't the Jews that did this, right?
Mhm.
Then why, if this is the case, then something here is not computing. So ask the question, okay, so what changed, or what forced Churchill, what pressures was he under at that point in order to, you know, make that statement to the world, which then effectively, you know, was picked up by Hitler and yada yada yada, like all the things that we've talked about already in the podcast.
Sure. Well, what happened is after World War One, the Russian nobility, a number of Russian nobles started coming forward and telling what they knew, and basically telling the story that the British had deceived them and betrayed them, that the British had enlisted their support. And includes members of the Russian royal family.
Mm.
Basically, the whole royal family was betraying Tsar Nicholas II behind his back. They were all going to the British, and they were all being courted by the British ambassador, a guy named George Buchanan, and he was telling them, "Oh, look, your cousin Nicky over there, he's just a retrograde reactionary conservative. He doesn't understand the glories of liberalism like you guys do." And basically, what he promised them, and again, it was one of these situations where it was the Trump factor. 100 years before Trump, where the British ambassador was saying to these Russian noblemen and noble women, he was saying, "Look, your cousin Nicky, he's Trump. He's he's a reactionary. He's a conservative. We don't want that. You want to be able to hold up your heads with all your fellow aristocrats in the advanced Western countries. So you have to stick with us. We're going to overthrow Nicky, and we're going to create a constitutional monarchy with liberal values, such as we have in the West, and then you can be just like us."
Mm.
And so the Russian royal family and the Russian nobility generally were extremely receptive to this message. That's what they wanted. They
Mm.
didn't want to be the bad guy of Europe anymore. They didn't want to be always getting beaten up in the British press specifically for being old-fashioned and stodgy and not with it. They wanted to be the cool kids on the block, and they wanted to be liberals, and they wanted to have a liberal government. And this is what the British promised them, and they betrayed their cousin, their relative, the Grand Dukes and the Grand Duchesses. They were all playing this game with the British, and they betrayed him. And so when the Tsar was overthrown in February of 1917, some call this the conspiracy of the Grand Dukes, because it was basically a palace coup. It was the Tsar's own relatives who betrayed him to the Duma, and they got behind the Duma as the new power in Russia, and they helped the armed forces to see that they should give their allegiance to the Duma, to the parliament, not to their own relative, the Tsar. This is how the Tsar was overthrown. It was by the British embassy getting the Tsar's own family to betray them, but then to betray him, that is. But
Mhm.
then after the Russian nobles played ball with the British in this way, after they betrayed the Tsar, helped to overthrow him, then they were betrayed. The
Mhm.
British betrayed them next by bringing in the Bolsheviks or allowing the Bolsheviks in, and the Bolsheviks basically exterminated the Romanov dynasty. Anyone they could get their hands on, they killed them,
Mhm.
men, women, and children, but especially the male heirs. They went on a program of of exterminating them. And again, this is often, with these with the new anti-Semites, the new anti-Semitism. They'll say, well, this shows how terrible and barbaric these Jewish Bolsheviks were, that they did this. But again, it's the Bolsheviks were one component in this gigantic British war machine,
Mhm.
this gigantic British, we can call it a color revolution, although we often think of color revolutions as being bloodless conflicts. And this was a conflict in which 10 million people died, the
Mhm.
Russian Civil War, but the British were in charge of it.
Mhm.
And I'm convinced that all of the atrocities of this, what is called the Red Terror, the killing of the Tsar, the systematic hunting down and extermination of the Romanov dynasty, uh, the slaughtering of anybody in opposition. I believe this all took place with the approval and even with the assistance of the British government, because for the simple reason that the British were always in a position to stop it if they wanted to stop it, and they didn't. And at one point after another, as Winston Churchill himself describes through his official biographer, every time there was an opportunity to stop it, the British chose not to stop it. So anyway, that's a long-winded introduction to my answer to your question. So
Okay.
why did Churchill blame it on the Jews? Because the Russian aristocrats began to speak out after World War One. They were publishing books, articles. They were saying,
Hmm.
"Hey, the British told me this, and then they had my whole family got wiped out." And they were telling their story, and it was starting to get uncomfortable for the British.
Hmm.
They were being accused of what they really did. So I believe that Winston Churchill, working with the official propaganda organs of the British Empire, the people who had been during the war with Wellington House, the War Propaganda Bureau, all these uh, institutions. You can, I discuss this in my book. I name names. You can see the same people who were running the wartime propaganda apparatus were the same people who were helping Churchill do the anti-Jewish campaign after the war. They were the same individuals,
Hmm.
and it was a massive, massive campaign. So Churchill was writing articles, giving speeches, saying the Jews did it. It's the Jews caused the Bolshevik Revolution. They caused all these revolutions,
Hmm.
and then they published the protocols of the Elders of Zion for the first time in a British edition, and this was clearly done. The people who did it, the translators, and everybody connected with that project were all British military intelligence people uh, at a very high level, and they published this book, and they translated the protocols of the Elders of Zion into English, and they came out with a very um, prestigious English edition, which was published through a prestige press in England that was known for doing work for the British Crown, for doing
Mm.
books like well, the Anglican Prayer Book, the King James Bible, things that were
Hmm.
Crown copyrights owned by the Crown. This was one of the prestigious houses that published that sort of book, and they're the ones who were chosen to publish this book, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it was massively promoted, the rollout of this book through the British press, and positively promoted, while Churchill was out there, making clear to the people that he personally endorsed this idea that a Jewish cabal had invented communism, had done all these communist revolutions, all revolutions going back to the French Revolution
Hmm.
and even the attempted revolution of the Bavarian Illuminati back in 1776. Churchill himself, he accused him of this.
Mm.
And in doing so, and he cited certain authors such as Nestor Webster, who was a famous conspiracy author of that time, who had massive connections with the British intelligence and propaganda apparatus. Her brother was a big British intelligence guy, and her father was a huge British banker, one of the most powerful men in the country. She was obviously establishment all the way, this Nesta Webster, but she wrote these conspiracy books in which she promoted the idea that occultic secret societies were the moving forces behind most historical events, including the French Revolution and other revolutions. So she was mostly blaming the Freemasons and the Illuminati, and particularly a clique of German occultists who she claimed had taken over the Masonic lodges. But under the influence of Churchill, who was promoting her from his lofty place as war secretary, directly under his influence, she started changing her story and putting more emphasis on the Jews. And
Mm.
instead of blaming these German occultists who were working for the Prussian monarchy, that was her original
Mm.
theory that she put forth in her book on the French Revolution. Under Churchill's influence, she started saying, yes, it was the German occultists and the Prussian monarchy, but also the Jews. and the Jews were working with them. The Jews were
Mm.
their agents, and with each successive one of her books, the the Jewish element got stronger and stronger because she was taking her cue from Churchill and the other British propagandists. And so what they were covering up was not only the British role in the Bolshevik Revolution, but in all these other revolutions that preceded it.
Mm.
Because what I showed in my book and in my forthcoming book, Who Killed Lincoln, I go even more into depth on the nuts and bolts of this British um, color revolution apparatus
Mm-hmm.
that actually did the French Revolution. The British actually. Um, I don't know if I can quite say they caused the French Revolution in the initial one in 1789. They certainly had a hand in it, but much more importantly and decisively, the British hijacked the French Revolution. They brought in the worst elements, the extremists, the Jacobins, who did the Reign of Terror and who killed the king and queen. And this accusation was made by, among others, Thomas Jefferson, who was U.S. ambassador to France.
Mm.
He was the first U.S. ambassador after the American Revolution, replacing Benjamin Franklin in that role. And Jefferson was there in 1789 when the revolution broke out. He and the Marquis de Lafayette were actually complicit. They were partially complicit in sparking the revolution. They actually supported the idea of trying to push King Louis XVI into adopting a constitution and having a constitutional monarchy. So they were actually doing that, and then they found their plans foiled by the strange force of these so-called Jacobins and these Jacobin clubs, from whom emanated the Reign of Terror, the guillotine, and eventually the murder of the king and queen. So Jefferson himself said the British were behind it, speaking from a position of knowledge.
Mm.
And he accused several of the radical leaders who waged the Reign of Terror of being on the British payroll. And he
Mm.
spoke very certainly about this. But it's not just Jefferson, there's other evidence as well, such as it's very clear that the British had set up a massive infrastructure of what we would now call them NGOs,
Mm.
of supposedly independent groups which had been created by citizens and were not supposedly run by the government. But these were groups which had such names as the London Revolution Society, the London Correspondence Society. And these groups were the French liberals, the ones who got the French intellectuals who got behind the revolution. They worshipped these British reformers, these English groups that were pushing for Republican revolution all over the world. And the French naively just adopted this British program from this British line and really kind of worshipped these people, and to the point where the French started in emulation of these British groups. The French started their own parallel groups with similar names. There was a revolutionary society in Paris that they created, and then
Mm.
they created these Jacobin clubs, they called them, Club de Jacobins. And they used the English word club to describe them as a specific and deliberate reference to the political clubs in England that they
Right.
were imitating. They were so proud that they were taking over the English example that they wanted everybody to know it, because
Mm.
they felt now we're on the side of the angels. We're going to be liberal like the British.
Right.
And the British did the same thing to the French that they later did to Russia. They recruited all the liberals. They used the liberals to give them an in, to give their agents and their operatives an in into the French government, into the French elite, and then they betrayed the French people by giving them an extremely illiberal government and a bloodbath. So the Russian Revolution was kind of a repeat of what they had already done in the French Revolution, and both times British operations. And then, of course, there were all the revolutions in between, which Churchill was talking about,
Mm-hmm.
blaming the Jews on them, so, which were especially the revolutions of 1848, excuse me, where the whole continent of Europe suddenly exploded in revolution. And I show, I think, pretty convincingly in my forthcoming book, Who Killed Lincoln, that these 1848 revolutions were personally masterminded by Lord Palmerston, who was the prime minister at that time. And Palmerston was an extremely powerful figure in that he ran the British foreign policy for, well, off and on, almost continually for 35 years, because he did 2 terms as foreign secretary, 2 terms as prime minister. And so during this whole period, he was really setting all the policy, the foreign policy, and he was running this tremendous spy network all over Europe and also America. And the cover for his spy network was a network of, they're sometimes called secret societies, but there was a network of these societies. They were revolutionary secret societies. Uh, the first one was called Young Italy. It was formed by an Italian revolutionary named Giuseppe Mazzini, who was a British agent, as I think I show convincingly in my book. And he started Young Italy, which was supposed to organize revolution in Italy and moving towards the unification of Italy, which was a British goal. They wanted to unify Italy to be a counterweight against the influence of France and Austria, which were basically running Italy because it was all broken up into small pieces. So it was easy for these other powers to run. The British wanted to unify Italy and have a balance of power between Austria, Italy, and France, lessening the power of France and Austria. So Giuseppe Mazzini and the other Italian patriots, such as Garibaldi,
Mm-hmm.
who came out of Mazzini's movement. He was one of Mazzini's followers. These people were all run from London. The whole movement was run from London. And after Young Italy, Mazzini then founded Young Europe and then started creating spin-off groups in every country: Young France, Young Germany, Young
Right.
Poland. There was a Young England, and there was a Young America. And I show in my book that it was from this Young America branch of the Mazzini network that the whole conspiracy to cause the Civil War, to cause the secession, and then ultimately to kill Lincoln, all came out of this Young America group, which was part of this Palmerston's network.
Interesting. So, I mean, I'm as I'm listening to you talk, and I've been purposefully not interrupting you, because I wanted to just let you lay out, as many of your arguments as you would like here, because I think these are aspects of history. Whether I can push back on them or I can't push back on them, I'm not going to attempt to try. It's for the listener to, do with what they will. But what I'm going to say is, as I'm listening to you speak, I'm just I'm just seeing the parallels everywhere today,
Mm-hmm.
all over the United States. I don't care if we're talking about the United States or we're talking about this place or that, Germany, France, what it does, Russia. It's all the same thing over and over and over again. And, these are, you talk about, the revolutions of 1848. And all I can think of was the Arab Spring under Obama. Like, you know what I mean?
Yes,
It's the same thing. Like, and we know
it's
the
the
Muslim
same.
Brotherhood, right? We know the Muslim Brotherhood is a City of London creation, and we know all of these things. And so, it's and they're running the same playbook here in the United States right now. They the point you made way back at the beginning of the podcast, I think, is the most important part here. And I think we should probably tie it up here now, and I'll just bring you back on the show, and we'll talk about this again after your book comes out, because I can't wait to have you go through that as well. Is the following, which is that think about everything that Richard's talked about, and then go back to what he said at the beginning, which is that they pick on the groups that have a grievance, and they build that grievance into a thing, and they turn it into something real. They take a nebulous grievance and they turn it into a political movement. And then they use that as a means by which to start setting groups against each other domestically.
Mm-hmm.
And we can do the math now, folks. I don't need to paint that fucking picture for you. And just like we can do the same math on what they've done in Ukraine between Ukrainians and Russians, by over and over and over again. And that is your receipt, as it were, that you're never going to get the British are never going to stand up and say, yeah, we did it. Yeah, it was us. They're never going to admit it. They're never going to, no one's ever going to put them in court and prove it, or this or that or anything else. This is for history. This is the way things work. And we have to be savvy enough to be able to not be hypnotized by the shiny thing being dangled in front of us, and look at who's holding the shiny thing that's being dangled in front of us. And what bothers me is I can see it very clearly now. You start going through this young Europe, young Italy, young Germany, young America. And now we have this rabidly anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish, America First group running around, radicalizing the next generation of young Americans. And I can see it. I call bullshit on it. I know where that's coming from, and I don't care if I'm wrong about it. I'm going to be frank and honest. That's not your job, Richard. That's my job. My job is to be you're the historian. It's my job to be to call bullshit on all of this. And that's what I'm seeing. And, from 10/8/2023, 10/7 happens, a bunch of, Hamas attacks Israel. On 10/8, I start watching the entirety of the social media space landscape change overnight. After 30 years of us not being allowed to complain about the Jews in any way, manner, shape, or form, all of a sudden, every third-rate anti-Semite imaginable is getting amplified across every social media algorithm there is on the planet.
Yeah.
And I'm asking why. And I've been watching it just play itself out for 2 years now. And, who works for whom and this, that, everything else, it's all a very complicated mess. What's Netanyahu's role at this point? God's only know, right? What's Qatar's role at this point? God's only know, right? My point is that what I'm seeing from Donald Trump's perspective, and what I'm seeing the Trump administration execute on, is calling, no, I know where this all comes from. And he's going after the source this time. And that's why I think he went and met with the king. And that's why I think the king itself, I think the crown is in play for the first time in a long, long time. I'm watching him flip one of their biggest assets, Qatar, to his call. I'm watching him become the most powerful politician in Israel and not give the Israelis everything they want either. I'm watching all of these things play themselves out. And then I'm watching how he's attacking in the financial markets, which I don't want to go into here. I don't think it's germane to this podcast, but I talk about it in a variety of different places. When you put what Richard's talked about today with the things that I've been noting in the great game of global capital, I think a pretty compelling picture emerges as to what's actually going on now. And we'll see if we're right ultimately. But I think this has been a fascinating thing. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on before we to kind of close everything out, that we might have not gotten out the door here.
I think we covered all the bases, Tom.
Okay. Okay. So as always, tell everybody where they can find you, where they can find your work, and we'll go from there.
Well, you can find my books on Amazon and wherever good books are sold. I'm going to say the titles again.
Sure.
How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. That's my book, which is currently out. It's coming out in German in a few days, as a matter of fact. Um, and my forthcoming book, which will be out in a few weeks, is it's called Who Killed Lincoln? The Case Against England.
Looking forward to that as well. I'm looking forward to reading that one. And of course, you are you still writing on Substack?
Oh, yes, that's right. I'm on Substack, and of course, I'm on X at Real Richard Poe. I have a website, richardpoe.com.
Sure.
I think that
Okay.
covers it.
All right. Excellent. As well as always, Richard, thank you very much for your time and your diligence on these things, and for and to help illuminate a part of history that a lot of people don't want people to know about. And it's history's complicated. There's this is not the only angle on history, but we need to show this one versus the one that we get on a daily basis, and then we get a nice complicated picture of messy human affairs. So with that said, I'm TFL 1728 on Twitter, Patreon/Gold Ghosts and Guns, which is how we pay the bills around here. And with all that said, you all be well, you take care, and keep your stick on the ice.